David had only meant to grab a coffee. The lobby was quiet, eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made the air feel like it was watching you. He was the regional manager of a high-rise consulting firm, the kind of man who wore tailored blazers and practiced smiles, the kind who thought power came in the form of silence and locked doors. But what happened that morning wasn't written in any protocol. No corporate manual could prepare a man for the sound of his own soul cracking open. Because that morning, at exactly 9:02 a.m., David left a black woman standing at the reception desk and walked away. That decision should have been routine, safe, forgettable. But it wasn't. You're the only one watching this now. No camera feed exists from this angle, and the file containing the internal footage was supposedly deleted by accident. Yet somehow, it's here, playing, and what you're about to see is something no one dares to explain. The woman's name was Naomi, early 30s, elegant in a way that made people second-guess their own posture when she entered the room. She wore navy slacks and a cream blouse, and she waited exactly 17 minutes and 46 seconds before something shifted. Her hands remained folded, calm, but her eyes, they kept scanning the hallway, not nervously, but like she was tracking a sound only she could hear. That's when she whispered something. Just one word. Not loud, not angry, but deliberate. And somehow none of the interns, the assistants, the security, no one flinched. No one even noticed. Except the lights above the elevator flickered once, then went dead. David came back 10 minutes later, smug, distracted, phone pressed to his ear and pretended not to recognize her. Told the receptionist to reschedule the walk-in and nodded toward the elevators. She didn't respond, didn't blink, just stared through him like she could see the exact moment his life would unravel. Still, he laughed it off, until she turned toward him and smiled. There's something about that smile, not wide, not warm, but ancient, like it belonged to someone who had waited a very, very long time to be ignored. You'll notice the receptionist's face in the reflection of the marble wall. She suddenly jerks her head like someone just whispered her name from behind, but there's no one there. And right then, Naomi says, softly but clearly, "They're already upstairs." Her voice didn't echo. It sank, like it found the lowest part of the room and stayed there, vibrating under the floorboards. David laughed again, but this time it cracked. Barely. He asked, "Who?" But she didn't answer. She just walked toward the elevator shaft, the E1 with the broken lights, and pressed the button that wasn't lit. The doors opened anyway, the file cuts here. But only for 6 seconds. When the footage resumes, David is standing alone in the lobby, pale, sweating. The receptionist is gone. Her headset sits on the counter, buzzing faintly like it's picking up static from somewhere else. Naomi? Nowhere. No record of her badge, no last name on file, no appointment scheduled. But the strangest thing, every single board member, every last one, arrived 12 minutes after this, each one silent, each one dressed in black, and not a single one greeted David. Not a nod, not a word, just walked past him, like he was the one out of place. The final frame zooms in slowly, uncomfortably toward David's face, and just before the screen goes black, his eyes shift left and widen, like he sees something none of us ever will. Then a voice, faint, childlike, comes through the building's intercom, a voice no one can trace, whispering, "She's still waiting." And somewhere in the static, another elevator just arrived, but it never stopped on this floor. The intercom's whisper, "She's still waiting," lingered in the silence like a ghost's breath against your skin. But the building's hum didn't answer back. David's eyes stayed locked on the elevator doors, which had slid shut and now gleamed cold and indifferent, as if swallowing her whole was nothing more than part of the day's routine. But that day, nothing felt routine. It felt fractured, like the edges of his mind had begun to bleed into some place neither fully awake nor asleep. And maybe that was the real mystery, because what happened after? Was it real or was it something darker? The question began to gnaw at David like a slow poison. and as the hours bled into days, the certainty of what he'd witnessed dissolved. The files disappeared. The footage, the receptionist's face in the reflection, even Naomi, the woman who vanished before everyone arrived, faded from every digital trace, as if erased not by a human hand, but by a force that didn't want him to remember. Real, unsolved mystery, a whisper in his head would say, mocking him. The truth behind what no one tells you. But no one else seemed to see it. No one else seemed to hear the soft static in the elevator shaft or the faint echo of a name spoken only in shadows. It wasn't long before the memories started to betray him. There were days when he would wake with no idea how he got to his office, with no recollection of Naomi's whispered warning, or the board members dressed like ghosts passing by as if he was invisible. He caught himself questioning whether he'd ever truly seen the receptionist jerk her head back like someone had spoken her name from nowhere. Had he dreamed the flicker of the lights? Or was it the building itself, alive and breathing beneath the polished floors, trying to tell him something? Then came the recordings. David found them hidden deep in his company email, a folder he didn't remember creating, filled with voice memos and video clips, all corrupted, all glitching like they were barely holding on to reality. Sometimes, the audio was a maddening blur of static and whispers, other times clear enough to make his skin crawl. A baby's voice, soft but urgent, repeating a name he didn't recognize. Clara, it said over and over. There was no record of any child connected to the company, no mention in personnel files. And yet, there it was, etched in digital memory, the name a key that David couldn't unlock. That's when Emma showed up. Emma, dark-eyed, unshakably calm, and with a voice that never quite matched the warmth of her smile. She claimed to be a psychologist assigned to help David process the trauma he insisted was just stress. But her visits always felt off, as if she was probing for something hidden behind the cracks in his mind. She'd ask about the missing receptionist, about Naomi, about the whispered words and the flickering lights. But the more she asked, the less certain David became. Was she real? Or was she a symptom of the building's whispered lies? Sometimes she'd laugh softly when he faltered, a sound so human and yet so hollow, it made him doubt whether she was there to help or to keep him trapped. I know what you saw, she said once, in that voice that was almost too gentle. But sometimes the truth is less important than the story you tell yourself about it. Her words sank into him like ice water, freezing and distorting his thoughts. Was this all in his head? Was Naomi a figment of his imagination, a symbol of some unresolved guilt or grief clawing its way to the surface? But then, why did the recordings keep appearing? Why did the elevator still flicker? Why, when he closed his eyes at night, did the baby's voice whisper Clara in the dark? David's world was unraveling thread by thread, each moment dripping with paranoia. He started noticing the smallest glitches, his reflection lagging behind his movements in the mirror, the scent of a familiar perfume in empty rooms, the faint hum of voices in the static of his phone's speaker. Was this a mental breakdown or a haunting? Was Emma a real person or a ghost in his fractured reality, feeding him half-truths and riddles? The line blurred so much he could no longer tell whether the building was alive with secrets or if his mind was a trap of its own making. And then, one evening alone in his apartment, the power went out. The silence pressed on him until it felt suffocating, until the darkness whispered louder than any voice ever had. His phone buzzed with a message he didn't remember receiving. AI's video file labeled, "Watch before you forget." Hands trembling, David hit play. The screen was black at first, then a shaky shot of a woman's hand pressed against a glass window, fingers trembling, nails digging in like she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. The voice came then, barely audible, broken by static but unmistakable. You don't remember because you're not supposed to. But she is still waiting, and soon you'll forget everything else. The video ended with a chilling silence, the kind that stretches out and fills every corner of the room with cold dread. David sat frozen, heart pounding in a rhythm that made the walls seem to pulse around him. Outside his window, the city lights flickered once, then died. And in the awful darkness, he thought he heard it again. The soft, urgent whisper of a name no one ever spoke aloud. Clara. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling, slipping through his fingers like smoke. The question remained, unanswered, echoing deeper than any shadow could reach. What don't? They want you to remember, and what happens when the truth is less terrifying than the silence that hides it. David sat in the half-dark of his apartment, the glow from his laptop screen a fragile lighthouse in the ocean of silence that had swallowed the city. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the disjointed pieces that had haunted his waking and sleeping hours seemed to align, if only briefly. He had found something, a hidden truth, the kind of memory glitch that feels like a window cracked open in the storm, a secret long buried beneath layers of denial and corporate whitewash, now bleeding through the cracks. It started with a file labeled Clara, the baby's voice on the corrupted recordings that had become an obsession. David had traced it back to an old archive, a dusty folder tucked inside an off-site storage account he almost never checked. The records detailed a lawsuit filed over 20 years ago, a scandal that had never made headlines but whispered through the corridors of HR gossip like a dark ghost. A young mother named Clara had worked in the same building, pregnant and full of hope, before she vanished one day without a trace. The company had quietly settled the case, sealing the details with enough legalese to bury it forever, but the records hinted at something more sinister, a disappearance that everyone pretended to forget. As David dug deeper, a chilling familiarity crawled up his spine like the faint brush of cold fingers on bare skin. The descriptions of Clara's last day were disturbingly similar to what he had seen. The receptionist who suddenly disappeared, the broken elevator lights, the whispered names no one else heard. The files described how Clara had been last seen, waiting in the lobby, her eyes fixed on an elevator that never arrived. The building, it seemed, had swallowed her too. The parallels were undeniable. This wasn't just coincidence. It was history repeating itself, an echo of a trauma the company had erased from memory. David's heart pounded as he cross-referenced the security footage from that era, footage that had been archived but was, now, inexplicably accessible. The grainy black and white images showed a young woman with Clara's features standing in the lobby, just like Naomi. The same flicker of the overhead lights, the same waiting stance, the same silence before she disappeared into the elevator shaft. His mind reeled with the weight of recognition, the horror of realizing this wasn't new, that the building itself might be a living repository of lost souls and forgotten pain. And then, the unsettling detail that should have been a relief, but wasn't. The name on Clara's personnel file wasn't hers at all. It was a name David recognized instantly. Emma, the psychologist who had been sitting across from him all these weeks, probing and guiding, asking questions that felt like invitations and traps at once. Emma, the woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, whose presence sometimes blurred like a shadow just beyond the corner of his vision. A cold wave of dread washed over him. Had Emma been here before? Was she a remnant of that past? Or worse, a living manifestation of the building's dark history? The lines between time, memory, and reality began to twist into a tight, suffocating knot. David felt the walls closing, in the silence thickening until it was almost tactile, as if the building itself was watching, waiting for him to understand something he wasn't ready to face. He remembered now. The night he first noticed the flicker in the lights, the subtle distortion in the receptionist's reflection. It was like watching a memory break apart in real time, like the truth was slipping through his fingers even as he grasped at it. The building wasn't just a place, it was a presence, an entity that fed on silence and forgotten names, that thrived on the unspoken fears no one dared admit. It watched, from the shadows, patient and unblinking, waiting for the right moment to pull its next victim under. David's hands trembled as he scrolled through the old records, the sense of familiarity growing heavier. He realized with a jolt that something inside him had been buried too, the edges of a trauma he'd carefully locked away. A memory he'd lost not to time but to force. Because this was more than corporate negligence or a simple haunting. This was personal. The building's gaze had been on him all along. And then, as if to mock his fragile grasp on reality, his phone buzzed again with a new message. This time, a single image, grainy, distorted, taken from an angle only a hidden camera could capture. David's breath caught in his throat. It was the lobby, empty, except for one figure standing still near the elevators. A figure he couldn't quite make out. But the name whispered on the screen was unmistakable. David. The screen went black. Suddenly, every question, every doubt, every whispered word in the building took on a new meaning. The story he thought he'd uncovered was only a fragment of something far deeper and darker, something that had been watching and waiting for him from the very beginning. You're not crazy. They lied to you. But what they don't want you to remember is that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to consume you. And now, with that final image burned into your mind, you'll need to watch everything again, because nothing is as it seems. Not Naomi, not Clara, not Emma, not even David. Everything is a memory glitch, a half-truth, a shadow of something far worse. There is a silence that stretches beyond the walls of the building, beyond the flickering lights and the hollow elevator shafts, a silence that isn't empty but brimming with something unseen. A presence not just watching David but watching all of them, because David isn't the only one caught in this unraveling. Not the only one haunted by the fractured memories and the lost names that no one else dares to speak. There are others, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Shadows moving, through the cracks of the world, all connected by a thread so fine it's almost invisible, and yet strong enough to bind them in shared dread. It started with the messages, fragments of communication that seemed to slip through the static of phones and radios, untraceable, encoded in places no one would think to look. Cryptic symbols appearing on subway ads, in the corner of news, broadcasts in graffiti scrawled hastily on cracked sidewalks. A pattern that teased the edge of understanding but never quite revealed itself fully, like the first notes of a song you once knew but have forgotten. And if you think that's just coincidence, then you haven't been paying attention, because these signs weren't for David alone. They were for anyone who had ever glimpsed the edges of the truth, who had felt the pulse of something watching, from just beyond the veil. Shared dreams began to seep into the lives of those like him, fleeting visions of the lobby, the flickering elevator, and a woman's face, half seen and slipping away every time you tried to look directly. Names whispered in languages no one remembers learning. Voices that echo with the weight of decades. Memories tangled with images that don't belong to any single person, but to a collective consciousness fractured by trauma and silence. You were right all along, these dreams seem to say, but what you're seeing is only the surface. The deeper truth has been hidden for years, buried beneath layers of lies and carefully edited histories, found footage from 20 years ago that was never meant to be discovered, what the government never released, what the corporation fought to erase. And then there is the third voice, the observer, who watches not from inside the building or within the fractured minds of those trapped, but from a place where all the pieces pulse together in terrible clarity. This observer knows what the others don't, or maybe what they refuse to admit, that the building is not simply a place, not just a memory, not even a haunting in the usual sense. It is an organism of control, a force that feeds on identity, rewriting memories, erasing the lines between who we are and who they want us to be. This observer sees the subtle shifts in David's face, the way his reflection in the broken elevator glass sometimes lags behind his movements, the moments when he hesitates because a memory has been stolen or altered, and the observer wonders how long it will take before the others realize that their sense of self, their very minds, have been the battleground all along. The observer doesn't speak in easy answers but leaves fragments. A message carved into the wall of an abandoned office, a symbol drawn in dust on a conference table, a flickering light pattern that pulses in Morse code on a forgotten monitor. For those who know how to look, the messages are clear. You are not alone. The truth is fractured, yes, but it is there, waiting beneath the surface for those brave enough to see it. The question is, what will you do once you know? Because once you become part of the story, once you recognize the patterns and the whispers, there is no turning back. The deeper force watching has eyes everywhere, in every corner of the city, in every darkened room where memory falters and shadows grow long. And so the mystery deepens. Identity fractures and reforms like a broken mirror reflecting pieces of what once was, now distorted by the hand of something unseen but utterly relentless. Control is not wielded with guns or chains, but with silence and erasure, with the subtle rewriting of history and the systematic unraveling of the mind. The building, the memories, the missing people, they are all threads woven into a tapestry too large to comprehend, a web that stretches far beyond the lobby, beyond Naomi, beyond David himself. As you watch this, as you piece together these scattered clues as the symbols begin to flicker in the corner of your vision, know this: you were never meant to see this clearly. The forces at play have been waiting, watching, shaping reality in ways you don't fully understand. But now that you know, now that the observer's silent warnings have reached you, the story changes. You don't just watch, you become part of it. And somewhere just beyond the edge of sight, something stirs. The lights flicker once more. The elevator hums. The waiting is not over. The question remains: will you remember when it's too late? David sat alone in the dim glow of his apartment, the heavy weight of everything he'd uncovered pressing down on him like the cold steel of the elevator shaft beneath that endless lobby. It wasn't just the facts that haunted him anymore. The missing women, the erased memories, the shadowy figures watching from the edges of reality. No, what clawed at him now was a question far older and far more painful. Why? Why had this happened? Why had the building, the company, the invisible force behind it all done this to so many lives? And what did it say about the fragile, fractured nature of being human? This was no longer a story about secrets hidden in files or shadows lingering in empty corridors. It was about something deeper. The way fear and control warp the very core of identity. How memory can be twisted until you don't know who you are anymore. David's mind spiraled into that terrifying place where truth and self blurred into one another, where every memory could be a lie planted in his brain, and every instinct a manipulation of forces beyond his comprehension. The mystery was no longer what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, and what that revealed about the fragile nature of freedom, trust, and hope. In that cold silence, David felt the walls of his mind start to crack open, exposing raw nerves he had hidden from even himself. The painful confession clawed its way out of the darkness, the memory he'd buried most deeply, the one he'd refused to face until now. He remembered the day he first walked into the building, filled with hope and dreams, believing he could make a difference, unaware that his identity would be chipped away piece by piece like a fading photograph. He had been complicit in the EI. Silence, had looked away when things felt wrong, had swallowed the fear to survive. His vulnerability was laid bare, the quiet guilt of survival in a place where so many were lost. Now, faced with the truth that might either destroy or save him, David understood that his choice was not about uncovering the final answer. It was about deciding what kind of person he wanted to be in a world that seemed determined to erase everything real and meaningful. Was he to surrender to the darkness, let the building's cold control consume him? Or could he find some flicker of light, some thread of humanity, to hold on to fight back with? The air around him seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening until reality itself felt like a fragile dream, one that could shatter with the slightest touch. But within that fear was something fiercely alive, a terrifying awakening that cut through the numbness. The truth was no longer a distant puzzle to solve. It was a mirror held up to his own soul, reflecting the deepest fears and the faintest hopes. It whispered that survival wasn't about forgetting or hiding, but about confronting the darkness, even when it meant losing everything. And just as the weight of this realization pressed down to crush him, a fragile peace settled. The mystery hadn't ended. It had only begun to reveal its true shape. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a truth to be lived. The building, the memories, the watching forces were part of a larger story about human fragility, resilience, and the spaces where identity flickers and falters. To know this was to step into a new reality, where the lines between nightmare and awakening blurred into something hauntingly beautiful and deeply, painfully human. As David sat back, breath shallow and heart heavy, the silence returned. But this time, it was filled with something else. Not emptiness, but a quiet invitation, a call to all who had watched and waited, to all who felt the tremors of this hidden world beneath their own skin. Because some truths don't want to be found. They want to find you. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.